Hi, this is Ross Payton with Ludonarrative Dissidents. This is episode 9, where we're talking about the 13th Age. And of course, with me, as always, are my two co-hosts, Greg Stolze and James Wallace, as we discuss probably the most popular third-party D20 fantasy RPG after definitely after Pathfinder, but that was written by two people who wrote for D&D before. Very, very specific niche, but, one that is popular. Yes, 13th Age. It's a big niche. 13th Age is published by Pelgrane Press, and it is written by Robert
Heinsoo.
And
Rob Heinsoo and Jonathan Tweet.
Yes, who both were important designers for 3rd and 4th edition D&D. And this came out in 2013 and has considered a very good variant for people who want to play D&D but don't want to play D&D. So to get into what the game wants to do, what its explicit purpose is, in the very beginning of the book, describes that this is a game for people who are experienced game masters and players of all levels of experience. Personally, I think it's my favorite iteration of D20 fantasy D&D-esque RPGs out there. I prefer it over 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition. Although I think 4th edition would be my second favorite after that.
You rogue.
I've played a lot of 3rd ed. I played a lot of 4th ed, and I played some 5th ed. And so I played a lot of D&D. I've written D&D material, not officially, but like for third-party publications, for Goodman Games and Knights of the Dinner Table, and probably some others that I don't remember off the top of my head. But Greg, you've actually written for 13th Age.
Yes. It was an interesting experience. I read 13th Age and I immediately was struck with, I'm like, here's the character I want to play is a monk who's like, if Sherlock Holmes was an amnesiac, his memories have been stolen, and his one unique thing is that he's trying to track down the thief of his memories. But will he find out terrible things about his past when he does this? Plus, Kung Fu. Awesome. And I was stoked about it. And then I'm like, oh, and I see exactly how this story would go. I see the perfect arc for this character of, finding out. And then I'm like, oh, I could write this as a novel. And so I pitched the novel to Pelgrane's fiction imprint, and they're like, maybe. And I'm like, I'll run the Kickstarter for it. And they're like, oh, fine. And so that's how The Forgotten Monk came about, that, yeah, it's got a cool cover and was nicely edited. And I have a lovely hardback version of it on my shelf. And, I was paid an adequate sum, but it did not do great guns in the marketplace, which perhaps justified their caution. But Rob Heinsoo loved it.
Yeah.
Well,
I feel as a publisher, if Greg Stolze wants to write a novel of your game, you say yes. Like, why wouldn't you? Like, just seems like
I wish everyone listened to you. Tell the world, fans. Tell the world.
Yeah. So I haven't actually played it, and in fact, until the prep for this episode, I haven't really read it. But my disclaimer here is I've known Rob and Jonathan since the 90s, since the mid 90s, and Jonathan, in fact, since about I think 1992. And I used to share an office with Pelgrane Press for some years, sitting next to Simon Rogers, the principal there, and when she was working in the London office, Kat Tobin as well. And during the time that 13th Age was in development. And Lee Moyer, who was the art director on the book, also did significant contributions to Nobilis, which I published through Hogshead back in the day. So
Lee
I
Moyers.
don't know the game, but I know the principles.
Yeah, Lee, let me just take a moment to praise Lee Moyer.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, Lee Moyer's shit is wired tight. It's got a 13th Age has a very cohesive and the graphic design and the art look all work together very well, and the maps are fabulous. So it's a good looking game.
It's a very good looking game. It's a very concise game, because they get everything you need to run a game in one book. I mean, they could have split this up. Like the standard D&D thing is to split it up into 3 books, a player's handbook, a GM book, and a monster book. But 13th Age has all the components you need for a campaign.
And it's not a long book either. Well, it's comparatively long. It's what, this is no Zweihander. This is not bloated beyond reasonable arm strength. It's just over 300 pages. There we go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like 320 on my copy.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's James. I guess we should first. So you have you played any of the D20 D&Ds? Anything from third on? Are you familiar with those sort of? Because that's sort of like the lingua franca of this. Yeah.
I played D&D 3. Skipped 4 not because out of any personal enmity, but because I had small children and I was a bit burnt out at that point. And it's just, you have small children, it is hard to put a role-playing group together.
It is.
I came back for 5, been running 5 through lockdown for various friends and members of my family. I liked 3 a great deal, partly because I liked the people who put it together, and I had been crying out for years saying that the game needed a new edition and needed to drop the advanced. Little bit of backstory. I loathed 2nd edition. I thought 2nd edition was a futile role-playing game. I felt it was utterly pointless. It did not fix any of the things that were wrong with D&D. In fact, it introduced more things that were wrong with D&D. It took none of the advances that the field had made since AD&D had been released. It just it wallowed in its own backwards compatibility, but at the same time was not backwards compatible, deliberately forcing you to buy the 2nd edition and the 2nd edition supplements. And I said so in a couple of reviews. And in fact, I think it was my first Gen Con. I went up to the TSR stand and I said, I'm interested in talking about getting hold of some review copies. And whoever it was on the booth looked at my name badge and said, no, we've read your reviews. No. So, I know who it was. I'm
James,
not going to name them, but they are dead now.
Yeah. We're going to give you some review copies, and after we do that, we're going to go back to the hotel room and have a snake hugging party. We've got cobras and vipers, and we're going to hug and kiss poisonous snakes.
Hey, I wrote 4,000 words on how good the Gazetteer series was. Well, just the first of the Gazetteer series. You know, TSR was capable in those days of doing some really nice work. 2nd edition D&D, 2nd edition AD&D was not it.
Well, and
Planescape was also a piece of shit. But let's not get into that. No, not Planescape. The other one. What's the space? Spelljammer. Spelljammer was awful. Planescape's lovely. Spelljammer was beyond awful. Anyway, this is nostalgia. We're off the point.
Yes. It is very difficult, I will say, to engage with D&D and stay and keep your shoes clean of the mire of nostalgia.
Yeah.
It is the oldest game. And when we founded this eminent podcast, when we laid the groundwork of Ludonarrative Dissidents, we agreed we weren't going to talk about D&D very much. And, I stand by that. Not because I have anything against D&D, but I feel like the ecosystem of aging white dudes talking about D&D is a vast, flourishing, possibly overcrowded one. And yet we've landed on 13th Age, which is D&D, but not quite D&D.
It's a response to D&D.
I would say an evolution of D&D.
D&D with tweaks from 2 of the finest designers of their generation.
We will have to talk about D&D in order to talk about this game. But before we get into the why it's doing this or why people play or how it does it, we should probably talk about what it does first. So what makes 13th Age unique? For example, one of the mechanics in the game is one unique thing. Every player character has one unique thing that makes them unique in the campaign setting. And there are specific guidelines to make sure it's not a mechanical advantage. Like, I can fly, I have wings. No, that's a thing you can do in combat. But there are examples like, I was the rudest lady in waiting in the Empire, or for the Emperor's court, or I am the reincarnation of an icon, but I don't know which one. And so that's,
I think, my favorite example was, I alone escaped the Diabolist's circus of hell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And what they use with that example is, the writer's like, the Diabolist has a circus of hell. I didn't know that, but now that this player has put it out there, that's obviously absolutely a thing. Circus of hell? Who doesn't want that?
That's not even the biggest thing. What I mentioned, the icons, that's probably the single biggest thing people talk about when they talk about 13th Age, or what they like or don't like is the icon system. In the 13th Age, there are a number of icons which represent larger than life NPCs who are not gods, but are active world changing beings. So some of them are leaders of empires, like the Emperor, for example. Others are horrifically powerful monsters, like the Three, which is the three-headed dragon.
The Orc Lord.
Yeah.
The Lich King.
Yeah,
the Lich King was always my favorite.
Or the Gold Dragon, who is a heroic icon. And
not too far to say Christ figure, as the Gold Dragon has literally flung its literal body into this abyssal wound into the world in order to cork it shut. So it's like the story of the little Dutch boy sticking his thumb in the dike, only times 1,000 and with a soundtrack by Judas Priest.
The icons come into play in every 13th Age game because players each have 3 points to define the relationship with some of these icons. And these can be positive, ambiguous, or negative relationships. And you can pick either way. And at the start of each session, I believe, or you roll a number of d6s, and if you roll a 5, then you have something that is both positive and negative coming into. There's something conflicting about your relation that's going to come into play. If it's 6, it's something that benefits you. Now, if you have a negative relationship and something positive happens, that means that one of the enemies of the icon is helping you, or something that will be beneficial. For example, if you're an enemy of the Lich King and you roll a 6, perhaps of a secret tome that the Lich King once destroyed, and of its location, or a secret path that will help bypass the Lich King's undead forces.
Or you just meet someone who's like, I heard the song about how you told the Lich King to suck it right to its face. I'm buying you all the beers.
So this is sort of where the book begins by saying this is for experienced game masters, and this is where that comes in more than anything else, because you need to have a certain level of experience and skill at improvising in order to be able to think of what does that mean in my game session to have a conflicted relationship with the Emperor, and that's coming up right now in gameplay, or a positive thing with the orc, with the warlord, or the Three, or one of the villains icons. And it's an incredible tool to generate interesting encounters and plot hooks and things to happen. They're the proverbial 2 guys with guns kicking the door, but that's always there. But on the other hand, if you're not the kind of person, GM, who can think on their feet, then this is going to be something you're going to want to downplay or plan around, like roll the dice before the game starts and have time to think that out.
You could roll at the end of the previous session, and it's like, okay, now I've got a week to think up what's happening next.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Well, let me dial this out a little bit, because the icons system and the relationships to the icons are, to me, sort of the logical outgrowth of a larger and more abstract thing about 13th Age, which is the D&D that went before it. Always was top down, or this I remember very much from my D&D youth, is that it was top down and there was a presumption of antagonism between the DM and the player characters. And a lot of that remains in the larger D&D community. And what this was, I think 13th Age was an attempt to get away from everything has to be defined, everything has to be relegated to the specific rules that govern it. And, everything, we can't have players just sticking details of world building in willy-nilly. That's the GM's job. And part of the insistence on there being a rule for everything was, I think, an outgrowth of that antagonistic approach. Because if your GM is trying to kill you, the only thing stopping your GM from killing your characters is you can wave the book at him and be a rules lawyer and say, oh no, that those dragons don't have that reach advantage in this situation, and so it wouldn't have landed that blow. And it got very, it could, especially if, you're an emotionally immature 13-year-old playing with other emotionally immature 13-year-olds
or adults. Like, let's be fair.
I'd try to be more than fair. But so yes, this is trying to move away from the strictly antagonistic, mechanistic approach of old D&D into, at least move it towards the midfield of some indie designs where there is cooperation and collaboration.
Yeah.
And this is not...
sorry.
I was going to say, it hasn't gone all the way there, but it's certainly, a lot of steps closer to that than James's loathed second edition.
Yeah. I think you've got a really strong point there, because I started off reading this, and literally the first thing in the book, once you're past 10 pages of preamble, and thanks to various people and pages of playtesters, is the icons, the list of these 13 archetypal characters, and they are very archetypal. They're not your standard Jungian archetypes or tarot archetypes, though some of them are clearly derived from them, but they're at the heart of the campaign world, and they define it in the same way that Greyhawk or the Sword Coast or whatever defines whichever edition of D&D you're playing. And old D&D, certainly first and second edition, I think third as well, is trying to simulate a world that is defined by, as you say, what things can do. And it's a very black and white, good and evil world. This immediately introduces shades of grey and different characters with different desires. And they do, and I think it's a mistake, they print a D&D style alignment chart where each of the icons is arrayed. And I can see why it's there. I'm not sure it's quite right. But it defines the universe in terms of interpersonal relationships. And the icons are not distant figures. They are right there. They are immediate. You deal with them. You have relationships with them. They are defined on your character sheet as part of character generation. And the thing this reminded me of, speaking of nostalgia, it was partly keyed by the phrase the Lich King, because there's a moment in World of Warcraft, in the expansion Wrath of the Lich King. World of Warcraft is very, very D&D based. It's the leveling system. You start off being able to do practically nothing except beat up low-level monsters, grab their stuff, sell them, get slightly better equipment, and you spend days, literally days and days and days, just killing progressively better stuff until finally you do something and, finally you get a mission that you actually have to talk to, your warband leader or whoever it is, somebody of some stature within the world. It's just an NPC. Wrath of the Lich King is the expansion where they start to get that right. And there is actually, you are part of a raid on the Lich King. He's the king of the Frozen North. It's been a while. It's been about 15 years since I played this. Excuse me if I get anything wrong. But there's a cutscene. World of Warcraft doesn't do many cutscenes, but there is a cutscene as the armies of the Horde gather to assault this frozen kingdom, and they draw up, and it's all done within the game engine. And Lich King has done this thing coming up. You are starting to work for the high ups. You're taking on missions, working for the generals, and you come back, and it's just flavor text, but they start to recognize you. Characters, NPCs call you out by name, go, oh, I heard you did work, and you feel, I am rising in stature within the world. And then there's this cutscene, and you see the armies, and you see the generals and stuff, and it's within the game engine. I was going, where is my character? It's the game engine. There must be a reason this is a game engine rather than pre-rendered. You're going to drop my character in somewhere. Somewhere I'm going to see my character standing next to the general, taking my place of stature within the World of Warcraft. No, they didn't do it. They blew it. And I think 13th Age, I doubt any of them, I don't know if any of them ever played World of Warcraft, but there's an underlying lesson there that I think's come up through a lot of role-playing games. You start at low level and you're a nobody. And you spend a long time slowly gaining stature. Within 13th Age, you are immediately a player because you have this relationship with a number of the icons who are the people that the entire background world revolves around. And that's a huge shift, just in the way that I can't think of any other role-playing game that does it, or at least does it quite as adroitly as that. It's a really, really interesting way of defining what this gaming environment is about.
Yeah, I think there is, you're both sort of like the paradigm of old D&D was that it is a physics, a world simulator engine, like a video game, like World of Warcraft, and that the players and all the characters ran by the same rules, and it was the GM's job to fairly or unfairly simulate this world, like a video game. And I think a lot of old school gaming is sort of built on this paradigm of players basically figuring out how to exploit these rules for maximum power. Like you've all heard gaming anecdotes about people figuring out how to abuse decanters of endless water and other items and just and spells to bypass entire dungeons and so on and so forth. And that was sort of like the mind of the GM versus the minds of all of the player characters in this very adversarial sort of world simulationist engine type of game. And then 13th Age is like, no, this is about making a narrative together, and we're going to take the fantasy art. We're going to make these rules so you can make what would be a fantasy novel. Like you're a lowly protagonist, but you have one unique thing. And even though you're a level 1 character, you have a relationship with the world movers and shakers because you have a special destiny, and we're going to figure out what that is and what happens to you. And so it's based on this idea that it is building a narrative collaboratively together. So I think that's sort of the biggest difference between D&D and 13th Age, at least through these rules. Now, there are a couple other major systems that are unique to 13th Age, aside from the two we've mentioned so far. One is, of course, backgrounds. Instead of having the skill list, you have backgrounds which operate as your skills, and you basically say, well, of course, I have a background as a reformed pirate. I know how to sail a boat, so I know how to climb. I know how to sneak up on people. I'm a reformed pirate. I had to do that all the time. I know how to swim. But you would not be like, of course I know court etiquette. I'm a reformed pirate. Well, that doesn't make sense. Which is so much better than D&D is like, here's a list of all the skills, and everything that we can't figure out as a skill is a craft or a crafting skill or a profession. And so you can just fill in the blanks there, which is a real, which was one of the weaknesses I thought of 3rd ed. 4th ed kind of gave that up, and 5th ed also kind of like, what are some of the, and then of course how combat works, and there's a lot for combat. But before we get into combat, are there any other character creation mechanics you want to talk about?
It's not a character creation mechanic, but another mechanic that struck me as being a big shift was fight on in spirit, which is if your character gets paralyzed or isn't in the room, you can describe a bit of history. You can insert a bit of character history that is, well, this is why, Throg the Barbarian is especially angry at these orcs, which is, they're keeping me apart from my friend the Bard, and he's the only one I really trust with my soft side, and so I'm especially going to take out my angers and frustrations on them. And so you can give little And basically their argument for this is, if you're not in the combat, it's really boring, and we don't want you to just go get on your phone.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that is so opposite the 1980s D&D approach, which is, dude, if you're not there, you're not there. How you gonna do something if you're not there?
Yeah, exactly. That, again, going back to that, like, simulation is kind of like, if you, it's, these are the rules and this is the mechanics of the system. Like, why would you, where the 13th generation, this is a collaborative game. If people are at the table, they need to be able to do something in the game, but yeah, so combat mechanics, there's a lot there. The 13th Age distinguishes itself from other D20 systems. Fourth edition of course, D&D, which was basically it was 3rd edition, then 4th edition, then Pathfinder came out, and then this came out, and then 5th edition came out, in terms of what came what. But what 13th Age does, they do a couple of things I really like. One thing, characters are limited to 10 levels instead of 20, which simplifies character creation and advancement a lot. I think a lot of D&D gets sort of bogged down in the sheer number of character levels and spells and abilities that you stack up, especially as high. Like, most people stop playing at high levels because it gets so unwieldy. But then the single biggest thing I like in combat is the escalation die.
Yes.
Once on round 2, the escalation die begins at +1, and then every round it goes up by 1, representing the momentum of combat as things get more and more frenzied and desperate. Now, if player characters disengage, it can lower, and there are certain abilities and powers both on monsters, I think player characters too, that can also cause the escalation die to go down. And but what this means is everyone gets a bonus to hit, and I believe to damage as well. And certain abilities,
it's only the player characters who get the escalation die bonus, isn't it?
I believe so.
Okay, it's only the powerful monsters that get to use the escalation die. Because, yeah. So what happens is that your characters become more effective every round.
But there are certain abilities that trigger off the escalation die. That
it has, it happens when it's odd,
or when it gets to a certain number, or things of that nature. There's a lot of different classes that use that. But yeah, so for me, I compare to the Oscars. Whenever someone's giving a speech and they start going too long, they start playing the music. Hurry up. Yes, the escalation die is like, I know no one's rolled above an 8 for the last 4 rounds. Let's hurry this combat up. Let's. So, like, I assume you guys have also been in combats where everyone just rolled low.
Yep. Or it's just a clown show. Yeah. Yes. Yep. Yes, yep. I have.
Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of trying to solve that. So I really like that as a player and as a GM as a way to just get this resolved.
It's a sweet mechanic. When reading it, you just go, oh yeah, that way. I mean, it's giving mechanical effects to the round counter. But it's just, I've played, I wish I could remember the name of it. I play a lot of free-to-play role-playing games on my phone. And there was one recently that was clearly doing that. And so when I then came across it in the book, it's like, that's who, I don't know whoever worked on this game. I'm pretty sure they've read 13th Age.
So that's the single thing I like the most about 13th Age combat is the escalation die. The other thing I do like also player character abilities and classes are built differently, and there's explicit text at the beginning of each class. It's like, well, this is this play style. If you want to play someone that's because there are different players or different playing styles. There are players who read the rules and understand them and strategize, and then there's the players who are just there to roll dice and have fun. And it's like, well, if you just want to roll dice and have fun, here, play a barbarian. That's easy.
Yep, that's what I played. That's when I'm like, yes, this is exactly me. I don't want to have to optimize my spell slot choices. I just want to be very effective when I whoop on things with my big ol' axe. And I refuse to apologize for that.
But there are classes that are more complex.
The wizard's very complex.
Mm-hmm. Now I remember playing in a 13th Age game run by someone else, where I played a class. It's not in the main book. It's from 13 True Ways, a supplement from Pelgrim Press. And I played the occultist, whose powers trigger on other turns. Like they could be activated when a monster misses a player character, or misses an ally, or hits an ally, or attacks me, or things like that. And so I have to pay attention the entire turn. Or like when my ally does something specific, and be like, aha, now I can activate my thing and hit you in the face with this. Because I wanted to be more immersed in the tactics and the tactical side of the game. Like I said, I'm one of those players who likes fourth edition. So it offers a lot of variety. Now I will say there's not a lot of variation in classes, especially at low levels. Like a low level barbarian or rogue, they don't have a lot of differences between them. There's not like enough variation so you can play two totally different level 1 rogues, at least from what I've read. So there is that, if that matters to you.
But that's covered by your unique thing. One is, I'm a level 1 rogue who, I was my unique thing is that I was spontaneously generated by the filth of the city. I'm like a weird city orc, and all my thievery and guile is a reflection of the bitter nature of life in the city. And another first level rogue is, I'm just a happy cat burglar, and I was a rich girl who got super bored and decided I was going to break into my friend's house and steal her necklace, because tee-hee-hee. And so there you, and they are both first level rogues, but they're very different.
Yeah, that's true. So narratively they're different, but in terms of how they fight, it would be they would be kind of similar. James, were there any combat mechanics or systems or player classes that grabbed your attention?
I'm gonna have to confess, no, not really. I was surprised how close a lot of this was to standard D20 style OGL games. There are lovely tweaks in there. There are lovely suggestions. It's one of the few role-playing games I can remember, certainly one of the first big-ticket role-playing games, that explicitly calls out other games in its rules. There's the optional meaningful death rule, which, let me quote, Jonathan, that's the other thing, they talk about the designers within the rules, how their respective styles differ, what they do in gameplay. When they use an example of play, they'll say this comes from Jonathan's campaign, this comes from Rob's campaign. It's really interesting. It makes it feel, you understand, for those who don't think about role-playing games as constructed objects and written objects. It makes that much more front and center. But this particular rule, Jonathan actually doesn't allow PCs to just die fighting nameless monsters. In fact, he likes the rule from 7th C that PCs can only be fully slain by named villains. And then there's a few more lines. That's a really interesting way of phrasing a rule in a major role-playing game. You name the designer, you name a completely different role-playing game, and then you state the rule. That's jumped out at me. But the rest of it, I was just, I went into this expecting it to be a lot further, not a lot further, but further from standard D&D. And I think it starts off extraordinarily well by redefining with the icons. And then as it went on, I admit I skipped huge chunks of stuff like spell lists. I am so bored of reading spell lists. I'd reread the Ars Magica ones back when we were doing that. Because they're examples of spells. They are not, this is your character's arsenal. But, D20 spell lists, please save me. I have only a few years left. I do not intend to read them and spend them rereading the same spell lists or variations on the same spell lists.
Greg, were there any other combat mechanics that you wanted to talk about before?
No, none of those really popped out at me.
Okay. So I think we can move on to how the game does what it does.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of these that we already touched on. Did anyone else looking at 13th Age, was anyone else reminded of Lancer and its bifurcation? Lancer, when we discussed it, the thing that jumped out was that it was very clear that there's like, okay, here is this one set of very specific tactical map-based rules for when you're fighting, and then here's the rules for everything else, and they're much more loosey-goosey.
Right. Now, to be fair to 13th Age, 13th Age is very explicitly not a mapped-based combat system, even though it is D20, because they only have 3 distances: engaged, near, and far. And it is very much made to do theater of the mind style combat, where you do not need to have a grid and that kind of thing. But yeah, I actually, I not thought of that, but that is very true, that there is that bifurcation between combat and narrative mechanics.
Yup. I'm like, it's like a distance between, well, here's the D&D stuff, and here's the big narrative and setting stuff. The standard assumption of D&D is that, or sort of the unspoken assumption of a lot of the old stuff, is you can win and win and win and win, but things won't fundamentally change, except maybe at the end of the campaign when you defeat the big bad guy who's been the source of all this, because in D&D, everything bad comes from one single bad person, and once you defeat them and fling them back into the abyss or whatever, then everything's presumed to be okay thereafter. Or that is a very, very common save the world trope, or save the village trope. Whereas in this one, there is immediately access to big scope, and that is through the icon relationships, and where it's even, things have changed because my relationship with the priestess is such that when I nearly died, she was very upset. And this has what a modern reader would call geopolitical ramifications. So it makes the setting much swingier than a typical D&D setting. I mean, it's not changing things in a big way isn't central like in the Quiet Year, but it's at least conceptually possible.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, I think the one unique thing and the icon system does, especially character creation, is the GM has to sort of like interpret what these mean for what the player wants. And hopefully they have a conversation to be explicit so everyone's on the same page about like, I'm going to have a 3-point negative relationship with the orc, with the warlord. And I want to have I have been destined, a comet appeared when I was born, indicating to some prophets that I would be the one to slay the warlord. The player's like, I want to kill a lot of orcs in my game, for example. And the GM's like, you know what? You need some courtly intrigue with the elven queen, and like,
right,
yeah. So, hopefully these tools that the players can do to define certain things give the GM an understanding of like what the players want in a game, and which doesn't happen explicitly with D&D. D&D is again just like this is the fantasy world, and here are the rules to simulate what happens in the fantasy world. This is rules to generate what happens on this hex, what's on this hex, and what's in this dungeon, and who the inhabitants are. But then to make up a plot, that's on you. I don't know. It's a plot.
Well, and consider it's a little more democratic, isn't it? Consider my character that I was so fired up about that I wrote a whole novel where clearly one of his skills is world's greatest detective, or certainly a very, very good detective. If a player brought that to me at the table and I'm running 13th Age, I'm like, well, guess I know what kind of plots I should be throwing this guy as red meat. He does not want to just punch his way through everything with his kung fu. He wants to punch his way through some things, but other things he wants to have to Sherlock around. And so and this is something I always approve of in games, whether it's written in the text or just bolted on at the table is the GM going, okay, my players are giving me big signs, big flags planted where they want their characters to succeed and where they want their characters to be challenged. And, read the flags, read the room. If your players have all constructed diplomats, don't put them in, the gladiatorial death pits scenario.
Yeah. That's true. This game is basically D&D, but without trying to cut out as much of the wargaming cruft that has accumulated over the years, and to focus on the way people actually play D&D, or at least people who are used to playing D&D. It's very much, this is not meant for new groups, because again, you need an experienced, or the game suggests you need an experienced GM to run this. So it's trying to get rid of things like encumbrance rules and like coming up with, like, they have a lot of systems for, you just get level up at certain story points. You don't have to worry about experience points and divide, and like they minimize what gold is in terms of like, the double entry bookkeeping is greatly reduced. Yeah. So they're trying to create a system of D&D that is the way people house rule it, and they actually play it. So most GMs will come up with something to narratively hook players in after they've got some games on their sessions. They realize, oh, wait, that one time when I gave a player something that was really cool narratively, and everyone got really invested in it because like they found this orphan goblin child and they all swore to protect it, and they all fought to the death to protect this orphan child. Like, okay, yeah, maybe
not their own deaths, but the deaths of the goblins who were trying to take their orphan back.
Yeah, exactly. So I that's what I think their intention was, to get to D&D the way people actually play it, or that they at least, and they talk about this in the designer commentary a bit. And the designer commentary, that's an interesting trend too. Like, I've seen a lot of that in some games. I remember the Dresden Files RPG, which they do a bunch of notes in the margins. Of course, those are in setting notes, like the characters of the Dresden Files, referring to the rules as like a book that exists in the Dresden Files universe. But yeah, so I think that's how it's doing it, and I don't know if it 100% achieves that goal, because the icon relationships, there's a lot of GMs that may not like that because it makes a lot of explicit, like, this is what the setting is about, and this is what the game is going to be about, is these icons.
Well, yeah, it was never going to be an attempt to take D&D and make it a radical left wing thing. It was going to move it more towards the center when it, or let's not even call it left wing or right wing. We'll say, it was never going to make it a radically cooperative, collaborative, story focused game. When it's, but it's going to be more of those things than D&D had been, and probably more of those things than D&D still is.
And Pathfinder as well. I don't think, I haven't talked to the designers or indeed Simon about this, but I don't think it's a reaction to Pathfinder deliberately, but it kind of feels that way. It's kind of, both of them I see very much. I think Pathfinder fans might disagree, but they are games for people who don't want to play D&D, who have tried D&D and for whatever reason are looking for something else. And Pathfinder goes one way and 13th Age goes another. And 13th Age is going a lot closer to all the changes that have come up through the Renaissance in role-playing since the year 2000. Does not fully embrace them, because if it did, it wouldn't be D&D anymore. It's fundamentally, at its heart, it's still D&D, or at least D20, or at least feels that way to me, who has only read it. And one of my questions for you, which we'll come on to further on, is tonally in play, how is 13th Age not D&D? How does it feel different to D&D? But we will come on to that later on.
Okay. Okay.
One way that it's not like D&D, and I think this is also one of the reasons why. So Pathfinder grew out because people there was a reaction against 4th edition, because 4th edition was very much they wanted to solve the inherent issues of combat mechanics in D&D in 2nd and 3rd edition especially, and that is sort of like the common phrase that I see is spellcaster supremacy. In 3rd edition, spellcasters are just better than non-spellcasters. Fighters and rogues, single class fighters and rogues in 3rd edition were, especially as the higher level you went, were more and more underpowered compared to player classes that could cast spells. Not just, wizards and clerics, but also druids and like paladins and rangers. Basically, everyone who wasn't a fighter and rogue. The game became more about understanding these spells and coming up with combos. And again, going back to that, exploiting the engine of the game to figure out the best combo, the so-called save or suck spells that instantly kill if you fail a savings throw or incapacitate or whatever. And 4th edition said, no, every class is going to have a role in combat, and we're going to explicitly define them as like controller, leader. Those are the healing classes, and I want to say and so on and so forth.
Niche protection,
niche protection,
which has always been the hallmark of D&D. It's always been you got to have a cleric. You just gotta.
Yeah. And the problem with 4th Ed, though, was that while it is a wonderful tactical combat game, its weakness is that it doesn't play like D&D, because in D&D, there are varying levels of player, let's say, engagement with the rules. I've had players in my D&D games who just don't read the mechanics for their class, and they're like, just make a basic attack. Well, no, you're a fighter. You need to mark your enemies so you can do all these cool things. Like, no, I'm just going to attack. I'm just going to basic attack. I know I'm level 8. I don't care. I'm just going to roll the dice and do damage. She's like, okay, thanks. Great. So so 4th Ed, it required everyone become essentially a spellcaster in terms of learning the game mechanics and systems. And then, of course, the narrative mechanics were very divorced from it and very simplified. But, of course, in 3rd Ed, they had their role-playing mechanics were crafting and profession skills. So, it wasn't great there either. And Pathfinder came out because of that. People wanted 3rd Ed, but different. They didn't like 4th Ed. And we can talk about why that was started or how that happened and forever. But that's going off topic a bit.
Do you want an evolution? You want a revolution. Yeah. And I see 13th Age as very much an evolution and not an attempt to completely upend the future of gaming.
Yeah.
It's just no, man. It's like D&D, but a little better.
So 13th Age is trying to split the difference by saying, here are different classes with different playing styles. Here's the simple one, here's the complex one. But we're also going to do the 4th edition thing where all the classes are actually useful no matter what. They're actually good. If you play a 3rd Ed fighter, you don't have to learn very much, but your character is not going to do very much either compared to a wizard or a cleric, especially by 5th level or higher. In 4th
I'm an 8th level fighter. How did I wind up as this guy's sidekick?
Yeah,
he just told me to take care of the horses.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Yeah, that wizard can fly, turn invisible, and cast fireballs. I can hit guys with a sword twice per round. That's what I can do. That's what I like mechanically about 13th Age, is that it's trying to do that. And now I have not played full campaigns of 5th Ed. I've only played some one-shots, but it seems 5th Ed is going closer towards the 3rd Ed thing of some classes are more powerful than others and some are easier than others. But yeah,
I have to give a shout out to my son's observation, because he's been playing D&D and is now preparing to shift over to Unknown Armies and has been designing a dungeon fantasy game of his own, which, it's pretty good. But one of the things he observed he's like, I think wizards are supposed to be balanced, but aren't, because nobody's keeping track of, how many spell books are you carrying? Did your spell books get wet when you cross that? Well, you can't use that spell. It's in the wet book. Or did your spell book get burned? Do you have the material components you need to cast this spell? And he's like, there are supposed to be all these restraints on wizards that are such a huge drag that nobody implements them. And as a consequence, wizards have no restraints. And I'm like, okay, is that how D&D's doing it? Okay. It is a little bit, and I don't know how legitimate that critique is because I haven't played 5th Ed Dungeons & Dragons or any Dungeons & Dragons in years. And it's no longer something where I'm like, I've played plenty of D&D and I'm ready to move on to other things that are explicitly not D&D. So, and even 13th Age might not be sufficiently not D&D for me.
Yeah, it's still very much a D&D style game about fighting monsters, exploring dungeons, and going on quests, and niche protection. Because like you said, there are different classes. There are,
and the classes are meaningfully different.
Now, there are some I've read that there are some really great supplements and adventures for 13th Age, like Eyes of the Stone Thief. I've heard multiple people rave about being a great campaign setting where living dungeons slither up through the underworld and invade the surface lands. The Stone Thief is a monster that preys on cities and structures you love, swallows them, and remakes them into death trap-filled levels inside itself. And now it's hunting you. So... yeah, I like that idea of a living dungeon. Literally a living dungeon, but
that is Gareth Hanrahan, and there's a reason his novels are so good.
Yeah, there are some great writers for 13th Age.
Pelgrane have an astonishing stable of writers generally. I am a huge fan of Gareth's, and I keep saying he's a very old friend. He's a very old friend. But I am in awe of him as
even though you're English and he's Irish? I thought that was...
Yeah, it's there have been moments. But I met him when he was young and impressionable. And,
okay.
No, he's from Cork, which is the area which was traditionally treated appallingly badly by the English. To the extent that we and I use the word advisedly, burnt Cork City to the ground on one occasion. But no, there's a prodigiously good. There are a number of very, very good Irish games conventions, but WarpCon is very long running. It's run by the University Society for University College Cork, and they invited me over as a guest several times, and I got
nice.
to go particularly well through that. And then
I've heard about the Irish convention scene being fantastic in the 90s, and I was always like, oh, maybe one day they'll ask me to be and offer to fly me over. They never asked me to fly over.
Well, if
so it goes.
Yeah.
And now, of course, they would rather just detonate an outhouse over the entire convention floor rather than bring in a filthy American overseas, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. It's going to be a very interesting world when we get back to not having conventions online. And I think the latest WarpCon has just announced it's going to be online. They were hoping they'd be able to do it in person. No such luck.
I don't know how... to digress, I don't know when I'm going to feel just like okay going to a convention. These years have really, they put the fear in me, man. Yep. So that's going to be, going to be something.
But we should probably, I think we're at why people play it the way they do. We're sort of at the, I think.
Because there's nothing wrong with D&D. It's not, D&D is not the untouchable, flawless apex of role-playing, as some people would have it. But it's also not pointless, worthless. It's the hugest for a reason, and that reason is not solely that it is the oldest. I am remembering something a developer for D&D said to me once, which really stuck with me, was imagine, and this will go a while. This metaphor was, imagine that there are two people who both listen to music, but one of them is an audiophile with a high-end stereo system and a ton of vinyl records of old jazz standards. And he can definitely tell you why you should listen to vinyl and not digital. And the other is just someone who listens to what's ever on the radio and, likes pop music, likes some rock and roll. And so this designer is like, most game designers are like that audiophile with the piles of vinyl records. And most game players are like the schmo who just listens to what's on the radio. And I want you to imagine the mixtape that the audio fanatic makes for his friend, the radio listener, and how the radio listener responds to that, because that's how most game designers are when they are making their game, is that they are often making what they think the audience ought to want instead of what the audience actually wants. And I have probably done that. Probably a kinder way to describe that process is, I follow my passions. Mm-hmm. I do what I want to do. I don't listen too loudly to the public because I can't fake it. Either I'm really into something or I'm not. And if I'm not, you probably can tell. But if you are in the business of making games that people like, well, then what a lot of people like is D&D. And a lot of those people would probably also like other games. They would, they'd like The Quiet Year. They'd like 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, but they maybe don't have the time, energy, and inclination to seek out these indie gems when D&D is everywhere and very readily accessible. And, that's okay.
It's okay, but let's be honest. D&D is like, if you had to introduce a person to a role-playing game, D&D is not like a even top 10 choice of like what system you should introduce people to role-playing games to.
Unless you want them to be able to find a group of other players for it anywhere they go on Earth and also on the planet of the apes.
Right.
It is the lingua franca. It is the language that almost all role players speak and are familiar with, and can play. Those who are familiar with it can play around with it and adapt it and tweak it very easily because it is very, very robust. But it is the equivalent of English, or the equivalent of I likened it when we were chatting about this before we actually started the recording in text some days ago. Not to Windows so much, but to Microsoft Office. Almost everything, 90% of documents out there are compatible with it, and I hate it. Excel in particular, I want to destroy every copy of Excel ever made.
Wow, Excel was the part of Office that annoyed me the least.
Have you had to enter text into it? Have you had to use it as a text editor?
No, I use a word processor.
Then you have lived a blessed life. An awful lot of video game writing, Excel is the text editor that you will use. You create your text within Excel cells, and it is not built for that. In fact, it is built not for that.
I can't understand why I can't screw in these screws with the hammer as well as I could with the screwdriver. It's bizarre to me. And again, we're touching on the idea of using the wrong tool for the job.
Yeah. But, and the other thing D&D has that makes people want to learn it as their first role-playing game is that it's D&D. It's the role-playing game. It's synonymous with role-playing games for almost everyone who doesn't know about role-playing games. They want to know how to play D&D.
I would argue it suffers for that. I would argue that, like Kleenex and Xerox, the brand ubiquity has diluted its identity. There is now an expectation that D&D should be every game instead of just shit. People just let D&D be D&D.
Yep.
And that's what the D20 explosion was about in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. Everybody went, we can do our own D&D now. We'll do it as spies. We'll do it as science fiction. We'll do it as cyberpunk. We'll do it as horror. For most of which it is manifestly not suited at all. I mean, it's not a great fantasy simulation system. We were talking about fantasy earlier on. The style of fantasy that D&D simulates is D&D. It is a style of fantasy that did not exist before D&D.
It's its own thing.
It's completely its own thing. It's this world that's
hard to complain about a creative endeavor that has become so uniquely itself. Except perhaps when that creative endeavor that is so uniquely itself is expected to also be everything else. And there seem to be people who think it is everything else.
Yeah, I think like D&D 3rd Ed, they try to coin the term dungeon punk to describe what aesthetic they were going for. I'm just reporting back what I remember hearing about 3rd Ed. D&D does D&D and nothing else. And I think 13th Age is the best version of D&D that is out there. If I was going to play D&D, I would play 13th Age. I think it does it's not perfect, but I think it does the important stuff the best, like getting an interesting narrative, getting players to engage with their characters. They're like, aha, I give a shit about my character because again they were the rudest lady in waiting in the entire emperor's court and I want to sass everyone. I
am not just another first level thief. I have this one unique thing. I am garbage. I am the voice of garbage speaking in the world. God, I want to play that now.
Exactly. Yeah.
I would. That's pretty good.
I think of my character that I remember playing, the occultist. Now all their powers are based on sort of manipulating time and stuff like that, and like rewinding time to undo enemy attacks and that kind of thing. And so I said my character was a music composer who came from a doomed timeline and is now trying to save this timeline. It's like, there's still time to fix things. Because
have you ever played Into the Breach?
Yes. Similar premise, but it was fantasy. And yeah, so like that's more interesting than like I'm a level 1 wizard with sleep and magic missile and so
and yet you don't have to get into time combat from Continuum.
Yeah, exactly. Another game that does time travel better than the whole game about time travel, weirdly enough. 13th Age is I mean there's nothing wrong with wanting to crawl through a dungeon, kill the monsters, take all the treasure, and come back to town with all your loot and turn in your quests. But like, there's just ways to do it that don't require arguing about grenades, scatter diagrams, and encumbrance rules, and whether your spell book got wet or not. And there are ways to do it that way. So yeah, if you're going to do it with 13th Age is my advice.
Now just picturing someone, my spell book got wet. I can't cast Cloud Kill. Yeah.
And I mean, all of the versions of D&D past AD&D have been an improvement, though. I will say that I've been going through older AD&D modules for Role-Playing Public Radio on the After Hours, and boy, they were just mean. Like, the player characters get attacked and then they get humiliated by these guys, and there's no way to bypass this challenge. They have to do it this way. And GM, if the players try to go around you, make sure they can't. Like that is just so common.
Wow, what's that from? Which one?
Castle Greyhawk, which is a WG7, which is a module written humorously with like puns and things like that, but like, boy, it's just a mean module.
Damn.
Yeah. Written by it's a 12 level dungeon with like 12 different authors, or like they did different people writing each level. And so yeah.
But they all used puns, or just
they were, it was all humorous. So there's like a level of food-based monsters, and there's a level where the monsters are throwing a party, and there's a monster where it's a zoo.
I think
monsters throwing a party could be fun.
And now you've brought it back.
Yep, it's
good going. You're making James flashback. I hope you're proud of yourself.
So I think we're is there any final word?
Final words.
Yeah.
I do have something actually. I mentioned I've known Jonathan Tweet for a long time, and I remember in the late 90s wandering around Gen Con with him and looking for interesting new releases and finding stuff. And there was a stall that had, and if this is you, I am so sorry, but there was a stall that was selling a fantasy heartbreaker, and it had a title something like 8th Age or 9th Age or something like that. And Jonathan and I went over and said, okay, tell us about your game. And they launched into a description of the mechanics. And it was, what makes your game different? Well, it's got more character classes. No, what makes it different? Tell us, what about the world? Who am I in your game? What can I do that's cool? And it was warmed over D&D. And I would be really interested to hear Jonathan's take on the same questions about 13th Age. What is it that makes 13th Age particularly cool? Who are you and what can you do in 13th Age that you can't do in D&D specifically? And I think the answer to that is not easy to put into words, but it's the experience he's gained over 25 years, 30 years, over the ages 1992, I think, came out. 30 years of designing top-level, cutting-edge, and of course, as we've said, Ars Magica before that, groundbreaking role-playing games. He can see the path to tread that makes, that first of all is an interesting path, but also doesn't fall down the cliff of either being too close to D&D and just turning into a fantasy heartbreaker, or over the other side and just being just another fantasy narrative game. I think 13th Age does a really interesting balancing act of being enough D&D for D&D players to move to it, while not putting anyone off by being too narrative and I'm not going to say avant-garde, but story game. It's not. There are bits of story game in there, but it's still fundamentally a campaign-based, ongoing, that Guy Gex and Arneson formula. It knows exactly the things that to take from D&D and the things to leave behind or tweak or just quietly gloss over. If I had come across this game certainly when D&D 2nd edition came out, I would have been so excited. Likewise, 3rd edition. This is the game I would have picked up again and played a lot of. But this game would not exist if D&D 2 and 3 and 4 hadn't existed before it.
And Pathfinder, I think.
And Pathfinder, yes.
Yeah.
As I said, I don't know if it's a conscious reaction to Pathfinder.
I think
it may well be a conscious reaction to the fact that, wow, you can release a D&D compatible fantasy game and make a lot of money out of it. Who knew?
Yeah, I think this definitely is an iteration of the D20 mechanic of the D20 fantasy system. Started with 3rd edition and has progressed ever since. And I think it's learned a lot from what those editions got wrong. It's trying to fix the mistakes of previous editions, of character class balance from 3rd edition, of too much complexity from 4th edition, of too much math from Pathfinder. Like, look up the Pathfinder grappling rules if you really want to. Like some
I really don't want.
It's always the grappling rules.
It's always the grappling rules. Yeah, it's not great. People like, 4th ed's too complex, and then they play Pathfinder, which was mind-boggling to me. And it's trying to learn that to make the kind of to take, this is the best that D20 fantasy can get, like at least in my eyes, because I don't think 5th edition has gone is a improvement over these mechanics. They're different, but and they're certainly better than 3rd edition, and in 4th edition, I don't know, 5th edition seems equivalent to me in terms of 4th edition, in terms of like the rule system. So, yeah.
And despite our ambitions, we have wound up talking about D&D for ages and ages.
But I mean, that's what 13th Age does. Yeah.
So,
I mean, we don't want to really get into the nitty gritty of the mechanics of
Yeah,
this is kind of like a bird's eye view. It's a big. The thing is, it's also one book, like I mentioned at the beginning. It's the whole thing. If you run a ton of D&D, get 13th Age, and like just run your same campaign. It's. I think that's the reason why it's so close to 3rd and 4th Ed and 5th Ed mechanics and Pathfinders, because if they went too far astray, it wouldn't be easy to convert. Like it would be very easy to convert any of those other versions of D&D into 13th Age.
Evolution, not revolution. Mm-hmm. And not everything has to be a revolution. It's an entertainment field. People want to have fun. And it would be exhausting if every single game released was trying to have the impact that, I don't know, Vampire the Masquerade First Edition had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah.
It's good. And buy the novel.
It is very good. And if you want to play D&D, get 13th Age. It's my suggestion. But yeah, before we go though, we would like to thank some of our backers.
Indeed.
So I will first off by thanking Weirdo the Sane, who I believe is an RPPR patron. Thank you so much for backing this. I hope you enjoyed this episode and our discussion of 13th Age and a lot of D&D.
And I will put in my thanks to Zalabar. Thank you, Zalabar. We will never forget what you have done for us this day.
And I'd like to thank Trey Adams, which is one of those names that is familiar to me, but I can't place it, and Google isn't helping. So, Trey, if we've met, if we had a child or something, I apologize for forgetting. It's been a year like that. But we are enormously grateful for your support for Ludonarrative Dissidents. Heavens, I got that wrong. Enormously grateful, and it's a pleasure to have you as a listener.
Mm-hmm. So this was our last of our survey episodes. Our next episode, which I'm not sure exactly, our scheduling is a little up in the air right now. We're trying to get
because Ross is getting married.
I am getting married on February 5th. I don't know if I'm going to have this episode out before
Ross.
That or not.
Everybody, all you fans, please congratulate Ross.
Yes.
By whatever means necessary.
Wow, that's ominous. But yeah, our next episode will be on Unknown Armies, Greg's game.
Yeah.
And we get to talk about that. Another game that I've played, and I've run.
I've played and run it a few times. Yes.
Yeah, I would hope so. And so we'll have updates on the Kickstarter about when that episode will come out. So thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
I doubt either of you will hear this. I'm just going to burble. It's London Toy Fair tomorrow. And you may not be aware of this, but the other two big toy trade shows in the world, Nuremberg and New York, have cancelled this year. So London is it, which means it may well be crowded. And I am slightly in dread. Asmodee we've halved the number of people who are going to be working on the stand, and it is a closed stand this year. You come in by invitation, rather than just wandering up and going, "Oh, I love your stuff." But we're showing off the new Growing Box. It's going to be really interesting. The Toy Fair didn't happen at all last year. Year before that it's always the end of January. So it was just as COVID was beginning to build and we were beginning to get a little bit worried. But it feels like a different world, and it was.